the national obesity problem shortly. As the hype and expectation build with the Sydney Olympics less than 2 weeks ago away, one of the game's major sponsors came in for some unwelcome attention of its own today. Nike, the world's leading sportswear manufacturer, has been accused of making billion-dollar profits from the efforts of workers in the developing world who are paid a pittance. Several human rights groups have spent years scrutinising Nike's ongoing work practices in countries such as Indonesia. One man, a former soccer professional turned activist, has spent the past month living in Jakarta on $2 a day, the average wage for a Nike factory worker. While Nike counters that it pays above the minimum Indonesian wage, critics contrast such sums to the multi-million-dollar endorsement deals paid to sporting stars such as Tiger Woods, enough to pay 60,000 Indonesian workers for 2 years. Annie White reports.
In less than 2 weeks, the Nike swoosh will appear on billboards, television screens and most obviously on the outfits of more than 1,000 athletes at the Sydney Games. But critics of the Nike company are also using the publicity to focus attention on the cost behind the Nike success story.
The truth is, in 8 years of campaigning, we have seen only very minor and very grudging reforms. Nike puts far more resources into public relations efforts, persuading the world that the company respects human rights, than it devotes to actually guaranteeing fundamental freedoms.
Human rights activists joined forces in a press conference in Sydney today.
Developing humanity, preserving human dignity, acting to promote peace. Nike does none of these. In fact, they do just the opposite.
Jim Keady, once a professional soccer player, is now a full-time campaigner against Nike's labour practices.
Nike's the industry leader, and self-admittedly they're the industry leader. And as a leader, they have responsibility, as any leader has responsibility. Whether you're a political leader, an economic leader, a social leader, you have to set the standard for how the rest of your constituency or your industry is going to act. If Nike wants that mantle of leadership, they need to own up to it.
3 years ago, Jim Keady was an assistant soccer coach at St John's University in New York. But he claims he was forced to resign after he refused to wear the product of the university's new sponsor, Nike.
In a very personal way, it's cost me a lot. It's cost me some very dear friendships. I played soccer for 25 years of my life, and to be forced to put it on the line to defend a company to promote a company whose business operations just ignore people's basic human rights, it's just depressing. There's a dividing line.
Jim Keady's beliefs led him to Indonesia. He spent the past month in an industrial district of Jakarta, living on the average $2 a day that Nike workers receive. Could you live on $2 a day?
I guess that depends on how you define living. If you consider living to be waking up every morning and feeling hungry to the point of exhaustion, if you consider living to be when you try to do some manual labor, you feel like you're going to collapse, then yeah, I guess you can live on $2 Australian a day.
But wages aren't the only issue. Community Aid Abroad has also released a report which alleges women factory workers are forced to undergo physical examinations in order to claim menstrual leave, a right under Indonesian law.
If you're not there to win, you're a tourist.
Nike's management was not available for interview today, but in a statement defended the company's labour practices. It says, whilst we acknowledge that our process is not perfect, the reforms that have taken place demonstrates our commitment to continuous improvement. Nike adds it has undertaken 2 increased age requirements for all Nike footwear workers, increased wages, and implemented a code of practice which prohibits mistreatment or discrimination of workers in any form. Nike adds it constantly monitors and visits manufacturing facilities to ensure compliance. Nike's founder Phil Knight has in the past publicly defended the company against its critics.
I mean, I just think they're wrong. They just don't understand the world. They think the world's flat. That essentially there are markets in all these things that really kind of dictate what gets paid and what doesn't get paid. What we try to be is good citizens within the country that we're working in.
Jim Keady and the other campaigners at today's launch concede Nike is not the only sporting company which has its goods manufactured in developing countries.
I would agree that a bad job is better than no job, but certainly a job that pays you well and allows you to maintain your human dignity would be the more preferable situation.
In Australia, a campaign to demand fair wages and conditions for outworkers has also focused on Nike. Fair Wear has developed a code of conduct which companies are asked to voluntarily agree to.
More than 120 companies have signed it since its inception. That's a mixture of retailers and manufacturers, and that includes companies like Adidas and Reebok in Australia, whereas Nike is a company that has refused since first asked until this very day to sign the Home Workers Code of Practice.
Nike don't have any factories that produce Nike products. They contract out, and quite often we find that the garments that are being produced for Nike are being produced by workers working from home for as little as $2 an hour.
But a statement from the company says Nike is committed to a no home worker policy, adding Nike will cease doing business with any supplier found not complying with this policy.
How are you?
Jim Keady says Indonesian workers he spoke with were horrified at the value of sponsorship deals with international stars such as Tiger Woods when compared with their own meagre earnings. And he's issued an open invitation to all athletes to go with him to Indonesia to see for themselves how the Nike dollar is spent.
I'd like to believe that somewhere in the community of athletes that will gather here for the Olympic Games, that there's at least one athlete that will have the courage to say, I want to hear the truth, I want to see the truth.
Annie White with that report. After an